at the entrance of the gallery, a reception sponsored by the student chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. We've become acquainted from several letters, emails, phone conversations associated with making arrangements for the exhibit, making arrangements to receive the exhibit that's now in our gallery. I've come to understand that the exhibit, The Life of Water, is extremely important to our speaker, and that she is important to the exhibit. We need both the exhibit and the speaker to have the work completed, and I'm very glad we'll complete the exhibit with Kathy's talk tonight. Kathy Poole has a Bachelor of Architecture from Clemson University and a Master of Landscape Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. She has taught at the University of Oregon and the University of Virginia, where she maintains her affiliation as a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities. She is now in private practice in Charlottesville, but continues to travel widely, making university presentations regularly. In observing her today with first-year students and with Pam Harwood's Virginia Ball Studio, I'm sure she is an excellent teacher, enthusiastic, demanding, inquisitive, and outspoken. The Life of Water and her companion research into the ontological development of Boston's Back Bay fens are based on Kathy's assertion that these wet lands hold their histories, in her words, more interestingly and creatively than dry land. Through mapping, Kathy asserts, the historical and ecological profiles of these wet lands can inform understanding and suggest design. Infrastructure is then elevated, again in Kathy's words, to catalyze people's imaginations and serve as poetic expression of our relationships with a place. Civic hydrology further raises the overlooked complexity of water in our built environment to heightened influence. It's been very interesting for me to unpack the crates and devise a way to present the exhibit in the gallery, so I've been exploring the exhibit as it appeared. Opening the crates, carrying them from the basement, lifting them into place, I've become intrigued. The drawings and maps are, I've realized, a very personal and complex investigation. I'm looking forward to Kathy's talk this evening to provide additional understanding for all of us about the life of water. Please extend a cap welcome to Kathy Poole.
Thank you, Malcolm. Can everybody hear me? Yes, sir. Oh, good. Okay. First, I want to thank you for having me here and my exhibition here. I love coming into the Midwest. As I've told a number of people, I love flying into this flat land. And it's just tremendously exciting for an Easterner who didn't grow up in this and gets to experience it all over again every time I fly in. And I am reminded, that this really must be the heart of America or something. There's something that's very gracious and welcoming and real about this place as opposed to some of the places I've lived in my life, which seems to have a lot of pretension with it. So it's really a pleasure to come here, and so I've thoroughly enjoyed my stay, and thank you very much. But I need to get moving here, since the work included in this exhibition is about a half, maybe, of the mapping works that I've investigated. But before discussing the actual mappings, I'd like to make one theoretical point clear, which is embedded within the title, The Life of Water. The point of the work is not about water or mapping, but it's about to find those relationships that are the potentials for design, the potentials for enriching the life of landscapes that we dream and we then make. So it's about making ecological systems more significant and boosting the richness of experience for those who are a part of our designs. So it's never about water. I get that a lot, and I just wanted to make that clear. It's about dreaming. It's about finding rich and wonderful content for your designs, for making your designs about something. The water is a vehicle for finding that. So now I want you to just sit back and just enjoy these 320 images I am purposely bombarding you with. Don't panic. we're going to be out of here in about an hour. Anyhow, I just want you to dream. I want you to participate in my dream for the wonder of what, and I mean that so sincerely, the wonder of water in design. So if I could have the lights, sit back and enjoy an MTV ride. Because I talk really fast, too. It's sort of an interesting kind of very fast drawl. I still drawl. I'm from South Carolina. But it's a fast one. Okay. And I have to learn how to use the slides real quick here. That's not part of the exhibit. That's my test slides. That's my daughter. Two preeminent scholars of mapping, J.B. Harley and D. Woodward, define maps this way. Maps and graphic representations that facilitate a spatial understanding of things, concepts, conditions, processes, or events in the human world. Like this very famous map called the Hereford map of the 13th century and the Ptolemaic map, which many of you have seen. This is true, but mapping is much more important than that, I think. With each new mapping, every time the world is made anew. With each mapping, a new world is created. Mapping allows us to make known and visible what would otherwise remain unknown and invisible. To put it simply, to pursue mapping in an exploratory mode is to design, to make a new world. They are one and the same practice. So the door was opened to these explorations in 1969 by Ian McHarg, who indeed changed landscape architectural design, not only in his concern for ecology, which we all know about, but also in his use of mapping. Mapping for McHarg meant mapping the elements, though, of these biophysical systems that he was telling us were so important, the soil types, the vegetation, the communities, the compatibility between biological aspects and human needs, and the like. But ecology has taught us that these elements, these things, are the physical, merely the physical, tangible, visible artifacts of ecological processes. These artifacts of functions, they are merely the static forms that are the results of the processes. And ecology has taught us that it is the functions that are important matters of ecology. It's not the things. It is those, but the processes, the dynamics are the heart of ecology. And these interactions cannot be mapped in discrete entities, and these processes cannot be mapped merely as colors or conditions, and they can't be rationalized through a matrix, however complex that matrix might be. And we've tried valiantly, this is a John Lyell diagram, trying to figure out how to at least explain a process diagram of this, but they just don't work very well that way. Lawrence Halprin was a leader in bringing to our attention the importance of dynamic processes, that the forms of the designs are very important, but that these static forms are not the most important aspects to understand about a landscape. And you have to historically situate him because he was part of a much larger movement of notational exploration going on at the time, particularly in experimental dance and music like that of John Cage, which you're seeing here. Lawrence Halprin, like many, were trying to incorporate cultural shifts and theories of relativity and challenging ideas about static relationships in culture and the natural world. And they all showed us how to capture qualities that we hadn't seriously considered before, and how to at least begin to tackle this idea of dynamic relationships and how to map those and show them to ourselves. Halprin's mapping primarily concerned the dynamics of people, as in this Nicolette Mall mapping, or the mapping of fountain movements. Oh, how did we get one off? Oh dear, this is always a problem. There we go. Okay. Halprin's working processes and mappings taught us to see sites as dynamic entities that are continually changing. They're continually renewing themselves, making themselves anew. And he taught us to see them as this incredibly dynamic thing, that they're doing this continuously. Therefore, sites are never what they are. They are always in the process of becoming. They are a part of a dynamism that is a process and a product of the many complex actions, things, events which have preceded them and are now parts of them, and actually foreshadowing what they might be in the present. For if we understand the dynamics within which our landscapes are embedded, and I don't mean apart, but embedded, then we can participate positively in the evolution of sites, which for me is the very definition of what we do as practitioners. We don't make landscapes. We evolve landscapes. We help them to become. And it's not just me, but there are a number of my colleagues out there who are trying to figure out how to evolve our methods of representation, our mapping, so that we can better participate in this dynamism. Well, nowhere is, you know what, that side's not consistently going forward. Huh. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, we lost somebody. Did I cut it off? I bet I cut it off. I did. Sorry. Okay. Nowhere is this dynamic, this process more apparent, in what I call wetlands. Now, wetlands are those portions of our landscape that are not quite dry and not quite saturated. They are those spaces in our landscapes that span this range between terra firma and that fluid substance that you can catch on your tongue. They include traditional wetlands, not wetlands, this is wetlands. They include wetlands, but also river zones, impermeable paving, these drainage swales, whether they're topographic or concrete, doesn't matter, the stormwater structures, dams, and for me they're very complex territories, in part because they are simultaneously wet and dry, and in part because they are contingent lands. As contingent lands, these wetlands are always in relation to something else. They're never something completely on their own. They're always contingent upon other forces, whether it's wind and climate and water budgets, biochemistry, soils, organisms, vegetation, root systems, velocity, underground conduits, rain, building, and compaction. They're always contingent upon something else. And these conditioning elements, these partners in this condition of wet lands, it's not as much a thing as it is a condition. They are of many materials, which I was trying to show in this panel, which was one of my mappings, which proved to be too heavy and way too expensive to ship across the country. So you have to enjoy this part as part of a website where I tried to put up all the mappings. They are conditioned by the pipes that drain water away from them, and whether they're historic or contemporary, which you're seeing both of here. They are conditioned by the pipes that puncture the land and bring irrigation. Wetlands are conditioned by potable water pipes and the steam that flows in the tunnels within them. They are conditioned by the rocks that are naturally deposited within streams and by those that we put there in riprap and in gabion baskets. Wetlands are conditioned by the fabrics, whether they're black plastic or welded wire fabric or whatever we use to reinforce these very unstable and highly relativistic lands. They are conditioned by the steam tunnels that heat them. And what you're seeing over here on the right, your right, is a locator tag from the steam tunnels underneath the University of Virginia. And they are conditioned by the pieces of slag that are left over from the coal burning that powers that steam making. And wetland is conditioned by the organic matter. This happens to be sphagnum, something I could actually hold in a basket that you could see, that allows them, in many cases, to hold that water. Now, I've used Thomas Jefferson's famous landscape of the University of Virginia to explore these wetlands because this was my home. This was available and easy territory and rich territory to explore. But the really wonderful thing that I'm finding in my exploration of UVA is that very similar concepts and techniques are applicable to other landscapes. So as you listen, I urge you to extrapolate the ideas from this to your own landscapes, to dream them into your own landscapes. Now, these mappings are challenging what has traditionally been called site analysis, because not just me, but there are many of us who believe that this kind of mapping doesn't give us enough content to work with, to come up with really full, rich, and poetic designs. There's clearly a place for these more conventional mappings and site analysis. I never want to throw out potentials for content. I'm not trying to be subversive or anti-anything. I think that these mappings do reveal certain aspects that are very important. They show features, artifacts of the processes and of the history, like the soils, the hydrology, plant growth, but they don't show the interactions of those processes with one another, the history, the ecology. These mappings do reveal certain aspects. These are some of the pipes of UVA and the vegetation cover. But they do reveal certain aspects. These were two very, very early attempts at mapping. Like, they show us the difference between water as a topographic feature, which is on your right, sorry, or like water's behavior, where I was starting to think about the process of water as a series of bowls, these kind of warped bowls. And that's how water, in a sense, might represent itself. But they just don't show us enough about those interactions with one another, and they are very singular. And so I started to look at other things. So in these mappings of UVA's wetlands that I'll show you, I'm not mapping water so much as the more important processes of wetness, I say. The wetness as a complex condition. And hopefully this will give us direction for the aesthetics, we always hope. So at the University of Virginia, wetlands hold their histories and hold their qualities in three basic ways. I had to divide it up somehow. And these organizations are the same ways, it turns out, that water organizes itself, and the way we as inhabitants of this campus have interacted with it. We exchange water surfaces. I'll come back and talk about each one of these. We convey water, and we gather it. And most of these treatments, of course, have had this very practical and utilitarian purpose, to satisfy some need for human occupation. Whether this was for water supply or fire suppression or power in the form of steam, wastewater removal in the form of stormwater. And satisfying, I'm not suggesting that satisfying these technical utilitarian needs isn't important. It's terribly important. But the really wonderful thing is that the university's efforts in exchanging, conveying, and gathering water have simultaneously presented these incredible opportunities for the university to exchange and convey and gather our imaginations. And that is the point of this work. So, to the maps. First, gathering. Thomas Jefferson chose a ridge upon which to locate this new kind of learning institution, which came to be known as the Academical Village at the University of Virginia. And in this ridge that he also got a valley that included numerous springs, two marshy areas, a mucky, swampy plain created by what was called Meadow Creek, and a watercourse that you can see there in the blue line that you'll eventually see disappear. So in this mapping, instead of representing water as a blue line only on a map, which is how we usually map water, the mapping suggests seeing wetlands as a flexible condition. So this mapping depicts today's water condition as a product, as a continuum of the grounds at their state in 1817 when Jefferson chose the property, when he came on the scene. And as I've continuously told my students, water never goes away. I don't care what you engineers do to it. That never goes away. It merely changes states. And because it never changes states, it never goes away, it just changes states. I've compressed this present state of buildings and the past water condition into, and I've shown them in similar line weight and just mashed them in a sense together. Not juxtaposed them, but in a sense shown them as one condition over time, because that was the point. Because they exist today. That water still exists today. It's just in a different state. So the idea is that you can view it differently by what you focus on, whether you squint, your eyes very tightly, or you open them and absorb the whole thing, so that you can see that that 1817 water is still present today. Similarly, the mapping tries to express that range of states, that flexible condition of water. This water as a fluid body that expands and contracts and goes down and comes back up. Of the soggy floodplain when it flattens into what we call the dell, which is just a flat area at the bottom of a hill. So you have these truly anoxic blue-gray soils of this once very marshy field. And these various gradients, as you can see in the mapping of these various shades of green and blue and brown, this flexibility of these microclimates of water within this marsh. And the bluer representing the more anoxic, without oxygen, these wetlands become when they get saturated. And these mappings try to show water not just on the ground. We tend to focus just on the water on the ground, but it tries to show how there are also the moisture of the cool north wooded hillsides in the afternoon when everything else in Virginia is oppressively hot. In another mapping, the watersheds organize the mapping. They literally are the structure of this mapping spatially. So it's very empirical in that way. It's a plain old, watershed map like you do all the time. But on another level, the mapping is metaphorical, discussing how we attempt to containerize wetlands, but it never works. We can never box it in. They slip and slide and expand and contract. They transform themselves, they disappear and reappear. And those slippery natures show how wetlands hold secrets within and beneath their surfaces, delightful surprises and dirty little secrets, all of which I think are fodder for design. Some of that fodder is conceptual, like the idea of stratigraphy, the layers of which that land is made. Some of it is representational, like the crushed gravel that holds the water in reservoir under the parking lot, and like marbles that you find down in the playfield that show how people used to use that land. These were found objects down there, and how it's still a place of play within the university, and how wetlands, I am continually finding, are this incredible place of play, just not in the way that we usually think about them as organized sports. This mapping is a molded map of many media, just as water is conditioned by many, many materials. It's that contingent idea again. Roads and parking collect and convey the water. So they are mapped as important figures that are, in a sense, extensions of the densifications of a creek system. We don't think of roads as having anything to do with rivers, but they have everything to do with rivers, because they, in a sense, are channels, and they almost inevitably end up going to a river. So they densify that river system, and in a sense are very clear extensions of it. So these various permeabilities are mapped in plaster cloth and nail polish encrusted gauze, because of their top surface has been made very hard. And the underground pipes are mapped as visible parts of the systems, as parts that matter and that might matter to a design. And they are integral to the larger hydrology of the place. Just because we don't always see them doesn't mean they don't matter and they aren't important. So I'm trying to make them seen. And they are conditioning elements, as well as the plants that are conditioning elements, which you can see in the watercolor, the different watercolor treatments and techniques that are spotted and blotched and scraped areas for those places that have been scraped down to lower areas of their horizons. And it is also a weaving of the seen and the unseen history and that's why I started to incorporate text in these mappings as well, because the more I got into these, the more the history became inseparable and important to these mappings as well. And this issue of history became more and more important to me as I discovered that, as Malcolm's already given away my punchline, that wetlands hold their histories, I'm just kidding, I think more interestingly and creatively than dry lands. I think they have an amazingly rich ability to gather history and to hold that history. And this is true in part because they are amazingly, stubborn lands, and in some sense, because of very basic and pragmatic reasons. They're difficult to develop. They're usually steep. They're wet. They're hard to dry out. The water never goes away. You can't do anything with it. And they often have very difficult geology. I mean, frankly, they suck. I mean, literally, right? Because they're always wanting to suck things down into them. And they're so mucky, and we're afraid we're going to get stuck in their mire. Plus, definition wetlands and bogs in particular actually preserve things incredibly well. I mean, think of, these kind of old, very ancient people we found stuck in peat bogs. So they hold them very practically. By the same token, I think wetlands are sedimentary by nature. They are composed of this wonderful, I think, detritus of time, which is what these mappings were about. These remnant lands collect the detritus and they stubbornly hold on to it. As I found in my walks through the swales of the university over 6 months, I just regularly would walk them and collect the things that they had, recollect the things they had collected. The cigarette butts, which I have a whole collection of these, name your brand, and I can give it to you. The thrown away toys that the children, thank you, play with, because they are wonderful places of play. And how these swales become places for very, very private activities. On the right, in the top left corner, as you can see, the condom wrappers. I collected several of these. So these are wonderful places, public places of very private activities and wonderful places of play. So, and I also found that these wetlands hold they collect species, they collect habitats, and they collect history. I mean, people still talk of the swamp that filtered the early campus's septic waste, giving greater credence to Jefferson as a great site planner. And we still find reminders of the various forms of skating ponds on which of course, at that time, all male students would court the local ladies, as you're seeing here. And despite the university's massive efforts to transform it into, quote, useful land, the mud refuses to convert to dry land, and reminders of these various water histories remain, which is why I began to add this is what the university pond that was there until 1950s. So I started to add these historical images to the mappings the more I did, because they became incredibly important. This idea of the histories remaining, that if you looked, if you were careful, and you don't even have to be that careful, you could still find remnants of these histories, which gave me wonderful hope for how we can transform this idea of historical preservation and restoration. And each of the bars of images that you see in this map corresponds to the length of creek or marsh in which they occur. So I found it necessary to convey these ideas through collage, a time-honored technique within graphic arts and landscape architecture. And the difference between my work and many of my colleagues who explore collage as well is my sincere belief that our mappings must remain spatially accurate. And we talked about this some today with various people, that people can locate an impression, a historical image, a notion to a particular place, that it isn't about some kind of nebulous, interpretive idea, of something. Otherwise, we risk making these maps that are personal interpretations. They're self-indulgences, which I don't think has a very large place in design. So these mappings, in my view, need to be spatially accurate. People have to be able to decode that information in a meaningful way. That there's a place for our very personal interpretations and drawings for ourselves, but there's also a very important place for your clients and public at large for drawings in which they can enter, and not just the design drawings, but how you got there and what your designs are about. So they have to be poetic, and which I think a lot of these interpretations, are, but they have to inform us about a place, not about me, but about this place. I also discovered how wetlands gather not only history and the stuff, but they also gather people. This is something I have begun to find everywhere. It is a consistent pattern that these wetlands have gathered people throughout the university's history for barbecues, for pageants, for golf links, and Lover's Lane, which has been there for over 100 years in the Dell for recreation. And my very, very favorite place of wetlands gathering people is here on what's called Madison Bowl, because it's in front of Madison Hall, but it's more popularly known as not Mad Bowl, but Mud Bowl, where students literally slather up when it rains, a good big gully washer, and they slide around in the mud for what Playboy magazine called in the 1970s the biggest, best party in the U.S. Well, UVA, in its very proper self, banned it shortly after Playboy publicized it. For once in my life, I come down on the side of Playboy. And I'm very sad. They're getting ready. I should both forward. Oh, where's both reversed? They're getting ready to put a parking garage under there and dry it out. So this last remnant of the marsh of the university is getting ready to be no more. I am so sad. And finally, wetlands also gather space. I think that, and this mapping is trying to show how we usually think of these swales, these wetlands, as divides, things that hold things apart. But I wanted to show how these two sides of a hillside, where the swale could actually be more of a seam than a divide. We now treat them as gutters. And this is literally where they do concrete, these are the cores when they do testings on bridges. And they literally throw them down the back of the hillside, as well as being trash gutters and places where they just dump all the utilities. And they're treated as gutters, but they could easily be an organizing structure, a spine, a seam, a space that magnetizes the structures around it, that it actually be something that structures in a positive way rather than a negative way. Okay, next, exchange. Oh, sorry, need to change slide carousels. Sorry. Ed. Oh, good. See, we're already halfway done. Or more than halfway done. Yeah, more. I'd take questions, but I'm scared of what that would do. So. Would it help if you had lights, Ed? For an 8 o'clock lecture, it would never hurt to cut on the lights halfway through, I think. I think this is the latest one I've ever done. It's the most uneventful one, I have to say, though. The first one I had to give on a laptop propped up in the middle of a gallery because somebody forgot the right connection to the digital projector, and I had to run back and forth from the maps to my projector, and everybody had to sit on the floor and then jump up and follow me around the room. So this is a good thing. The second one, I happened to they said I brought it with me. It was out in California at the very first rolling blackout of LA. And so we had to huddle in the back of this place where they give plays at a church. And I had this cardboard podium with little Christmas lights strung across the top, and with the mappings kind of hung up behind me. And with, they were great little Californians, got on their cell phones, rallied the troops, found a place, and everybody showed up. And we're this little place where people were literally right here, where I was speaking. So changing slide trays is no big deal. Okay, next, exchange. This mapping suggests seeing wetlands as exchanging surfaces, this flexible gradient between water and earth, which is the very definition of a wetland, right? A definition wetland, this exchange between water and the land. And granted, we have topographic maps to show these surfaces of land and show how they change through time. What you're seeing on the left is 1997, and on the right is 1817. So I've done those. Yet, these mappings explore these exchanging surfaces in a way I think that topographic models don't allow, because topographic models only show that top surface. They don't show this deep surface. And this mapping is based on a bathymetric chart. Those charts that fishermen use, because that shows a deep surface, and that was the model for this mapping. And like a bathymetric chart, it locates, the things that are high up, those surfaces that are brought up off the ground. And in the case of UVA, it's things like the rotunda and the coal silos where they power the university. And it shows these surfaces as these lifted surfaces, this ground surface, and this below the ground surfaces. In one sense, it is a really dumb and simple cut and fill map. That the blue is the amount of fill, the red is the amount of cut, and the numbers are how much that cut and fill, at least in round numbers, has been done on each one of these kinds of surfaces. So in a sense, it's a different kind of history map. It's showing the history of this land and trying to show it in one place. And it's also a way for me to tell people, and students and professionals alike, when they say, oh, but we want to keep it natural. And I show this to them and show them how all but about maybe 7% of the campus has been changed. The surface has been exchanged in one way or another at least one time. So be careful what we say when we want that. This mapping shows how we have been exchanging these surfaces in many different ways. This is showing one way in the section. All of these mappings have a plan and some kind of sectional exploration with them as well. To show how some of these exchanging surfaces requires that we look very deep, 20 to 49 feet deep in this exchange that we have done with the university lands over time. And that sometimes we have to peel back these layers to literally peel the lawn apart, the very famous lawn of the university apart, to see see that these thicknesses, to see them not as things, but as these deep moved and designed surfaces. And this is the lawn. I actually did a compaction test on this one time to check out that top surface, and it has a density of brick. How they get the grass to grow is way beyond me. This mapping shows how the surfaces of Carr's Hill, which is a section of the university where the School of Architecture is located, my ex-home, they span this broad range from spongy fields to semi-permeable slopes, layered surfaces, these impermeable parkings. And the focus is on the lands, so the buildings are represented as the voids, the negatives. And the lands are made of 4 different materials that are grouped and arranged, again, by sub-basin. So there is this accuracy that's very important to me, and this sense of organization and understanding this as a map that's critical. Now, these spongy lands are made with gauze, and the completely impermeable surfaces are made with mylar, and these kind of cut, scraped surfaces are made with this kind of plaster, your plain old plaster of Paris. And the real lesson of this mapping for me was in the process of making it, which became a very important idea for me. So that, the surfaces that are made of plaster cloth, are these very permeable surfaces. But once you start to push on them, to compact them, to mash them, to fill them with other things like the plaster itself, they become quite impermeable and hard. So the point is that the process of making the map helps understand the process of making land, which is something I would really like to explore further and hope that you might think about as well. In another mapping, the land is considered a very thick surface. And again, it's structured by its watershed. This is that Carrs Hill precinct again. And it focuses on the conditions. And it models the conditions of each of these watersheds and how they've been compacted, scraped, cut, filled, layers. In technique, this is an incredibly toxic epoxy that I don't recommend you do this in the building and find some hazardous waste site somewhere. But it's made of organic things. These lands are made of organic things like twigs and straw and inorganic materials like rocks, and that they're sometimes submerged just under the surface, sometimes outcropping as well. And it's also made by displacement where the buildings are actual pushing down of the land, and literally things that were pushed down and then pulled out so you could see them. And again, about this process of making these wet lands and what happens when you put a building in there and compact that land and push it away. And that some of them are also done with very made materials, trying to metaphor that they're filled with, some of them with construction debris to build up a pad to make a building, and how we make dikes, of very constructed materials as well as natural. So all of these maps are trying to add to our vocabulary, of making these wet lands, that they aren't just the blue line on the map, they're not just water, they are all these different materials, which is very exciting to me because it gives me a kind of freedom in the range of materials that I use in my landscapes. Okay, but next, conveying. I said that water has served to gather, to exchange surfaces, and to convey. And this mapping explores how water has been conveyed consistently throughout the university's history. The university's first system of conveyance was composed of about 15,000 board logs, which had to be replaced just 3 years later because somebody forgot about the frost line. And one of the most amusing letters that I've read that Jefferson wrote, he is livid, just reaming somebody about this frost line thing and demanding that it be replaced immediately and at least 3 feet below the surface. And he was right. And so from the construction of the very first pavilion in 1818 to the present day, these underground conduits have been extended, layered, networked into this highly calibrated system that regulates the university's water, both its potable water, its nuclear water, its steam, and its storm water. And it has evolved into a giant machine that controls the water's pulse, its course, and its volume. It is this, I call it this unseen superstructure that structures this vertical and horizontal movement of water, and that word structure is very important. So these mappings attempt to make this engineered drainage literally transparent, because I believe we design with what we can see on our boards to make it part of the visual content of that drawing so that it will be more present and so we won't think of it anymore as this neutral abstract service out there or at best, or this problem that we hand over to the engineers to please solve for us, which I think is the worst. Rather, that it might become an opportunity for design, to see it not as a nuisance, but as a wonderful gift. Whether that is an idea, I don't know. It might be an idea, it might be a compositional structure, it might even be an aesthetic. And this mapping tries to express the aesthetic potentials with techniques like the depiction of impermeable parking that shows how it might, these parking lots actually, in real, physical terms, actually collect water. So in a sense, they act like pools. So I represented them like we represent pools to ourselves, like swimming pools. And it also, it's also suggested to me when I started mapping to this that they were kind of like, your motherboard, this very high technology circuit board. So that they were, in a sense, working on both sides of this. It's this very natural thing that was actually very highly calibrated, sophisticated, and technological as well. And this mapping also explores what all of these mappings, I think, reinforced for me, that this giant machine, however calibrated and machine-like it becomes, is always dependent on the non-human topography and these topographic structures of swales and ponds and rivers, because as you follow this, you can see it goes in and out, and in and out. In the machine, pops out, and then it'll pop back in and pop out, and eventually it'll find itself to the river usually. And so these human-created and non-human created pieces of the landscape are organically interconnected. They're inextricably connected. You can't pull them apart. They're inseparable. The collage mapping tries to map how water conveys organisms, organics, and people. Where I focused on the unseen structures in the previous mapping, this one tried to think about how it conveyed the things you actually could see. And so in this map, I was experimenting with how to map, in a related way to the engineering structures, these quantifiable parts of the landscape. But to map those quantifiable parts in experiential terms, to think about how we experience those really important and very empirical, pieces of the landscape. So these vials that I borrowed from my biology friends hold these various small remnants of the natural world, and they hold these vials of water where I was testing, water quality. And the benthic environments, the bottom, of the creeks, and just scraping up them and to find out what I would find, down in there. And these are a way of recording that, of collecting it. And I did these in these water walks that I did over time. And the vials, they measure the water quality in subjective ways, but they also keep it in my visual field. Put it there for inspection and remind me, that this is something that I'm interested in and that matters. And also you can see these little strips there. There are various tests that I did on the water that I also thought were just these beautiful, precious little strips. And they're test strips for pH, copper, zinc, lead, and nitrate. As it turns out, we have pretty clean water at UVA. And as I said, these walks were done over time. But it was also what I found that in my walks over time, this isn't the first time the university's walks have conveyed people. There's a whole history of people walking through these marginal places, these little remnants, these little slivers that slide through the landscape. And so what I tried to do in the mapping was to record these walks, and you can see it here, and I forgot my pointer, on this bottom left-hand diagram, which shows this scale, this quantifiable scale, and what it's showing is your vertical distance from a creek. Again, trying to do something quantifiable that was also recording experience. How far am I from the water, and on which side of that water course am I? And you can see the line as it goes through the landscape, and it shows where you cross. You must cross the creek to actually stay beside it and be a part of this marginal land. And I also, when I started to record other people's walks through these lands, again, I was starting to incorporate more and more historical images. And so what these images, they correspond to a number, trying to use this quantifiable method again. So it shows the correspondence between an image and the place that it occurs, so that it isn't sort of this kind of very sloppy history. So that it's very exact, very rigorous history of their conveying people through time, through this landscape. And these maps are also about my imagination of how streams might be used as a way to structure development, again, a way to course people and things through the landscape, whether it's coursing biotic material through or whether it's coursing actual citizens of the university through these places, and treating them not as marginalized areas of the campus, but things that are actually infrastructural to the campus. Now, this final mapping that I did was a rather compilation of sorts. In a sense, this is my more personal map. This actually, it's sort of like a pre-schematic design. It's a series of ideas for proposals. Now that I knew all this about wetlands of the campus, I wanted to tell people, you know, what are the potentials for this? These can be really special places instead of being treated as gutters or remnants of the campus. So this notational maps, very much in the spirit of Halperin and some of those people in the 60s and even the 70s. It attempts to capture these experiential characteristics of the landscapes as well as these pieces of history that I think are fascinating and should be re-explored. So these notations try to capture that history, the stuff of the landscape. And it's very important to me because and it was always a question for me whether I was capturing that experience of landscape, which is quite different, I think, from mapping the landscape itself, because the experience of landscape is it's lived within. It's not something that is objective and out there, because part of making landscapes is in our heads, because we all carry around these psychological associations that don't have anything to do with the place we're at. They're things that we have acquired through our experience, and they live in our heads, and we bring them to a landscape. So some of the experience of UVA has nothing to do with UVA. It's what we bring, or any landscape, it's what we bring to that landscape, and some of which are not tangible at all. It's not just about stuff. So these maps, these marks, these gestures, these washes, these notations, they're meant to be more open than conventional mapping techniques, and they're intended to allow people's own imagination, for them to bring something of their own to these mappings. That's not just mine. Well, hang on, did I miss one? I may have misplaced this one. Oh yes, for instance, this is a direct steal and credited to Maurice Sendak, you know, because a lot of these marginal areas are where the wild things are, and they really are places of wildness. And that was not something that's actually there, but a psychological association I bring to this. Or John Tingley's, gestural marks and his dynamic, sculptural creations. So it was meant to evoke other people's associations they have with this landscape. Okay, so all of these mappings suggest, I think, at least two important lessons. First, that these marginalized spaces, and there are actually homeless people on the right. There's a homeless man that I spoke to who lives in one of these marginal lands of the university. And on the left, you have, basically it's a utility chase by one of the creeks that is at the headlands of one of the creeks, and then down to one of the creeks. They're treated as gutters and as undevelopable. They are disdained lands. They're marginal in the worst kind of sense. But I hope that these mappings show that these marginalized spaces are actually some of the most alive on the campus. They are full of life. Sometimes they are biotically the most diverse, the most rich, the most self-maintaining spaces of the landscape. They're species rich, they're biotically active, and they also, as you saw by some of the recreational things that happened in them, they are some of the most fun places, in the university as well. So rather than act as we typically do of, oops, went the wrong way, to simplify. That's what we always want to do with these wetlands. We want to simplify them, make them wetter, or make them drier, one of the two. But in fact, maybe what we should be thinking about is how they have this incredible range of expressive qualities, just like they have a range of different wetness conditions within them. The second thing that these mappings suggest, that if they are so full of both biotic life and expressive potential, then we should shift our thinking from there being marginal territories to there being necessary, to there being infrastructure, absolutely necessary to the building of a place. And these mappings, this particular mapping, denotes how wetlands might be thought of as a necessary infrastructure, something that actually structures development. Not is leftover, but actually is the main part of any development. So that rather than it being incidental to design, that it might be considered, as I consider that, like, and I think is depicted in this model, a superstructure. That it's so key in the flow of water, so key in supporting what is above it, so spatially extensive, because these pipes, you just can't even imagine how extensive they are, that we might think of them as kind of a newer, geology, that they are incredibly necessary and that important to a landscape. Okay, so this is where we get to Carl Steinitz's infamous question, so what? You always got to ask this, I think. If all this mapping doesn't help us make designs that are any better, if it's merely some academic exercise or some self-indulgence by this, chick from the South, then who cares? So, I explored how to use these understandings I gained from my mapping to form the spaces, to form a design, to build a design for a piece of the university known as the Arts Precinct. The idea of exchanging surfaces are expressed in physical terms and allow new possibilities, I hope, to emerge. Surfaces exchange with one another, solid grounds become bridges, earth wedges ramp into water that reveals and hides them according to climate and season and water level. And second, by using the ecological processes of stormwater, which are namely sedimentation, toxin removal, vegetation growth, and design, and flooding, then the program for this fine arts this precinct could be fulfilled beyond merely the uses or the buildings or even the outdoor spaces. The basic program for these spaces is this expansion of this fine arts complex to add and move some of the other fine arts uses of the university over to this backside of a hill. This is very much marginal land. It is on the back edge of campus down by the railroad tracks and along one of those very disdained wetlands that they have tried very hard to make useful by making it a parking lot. And I forgot my pointer, but that's what it ends up being. And the only building there, well, there are two buildings there now, you can see is this bottommost long building. That's the architecture school and this drama building. And all the things that are in brown have been added, darker brown. This is what it looks like now. Lovely. The backside of a hill that they've just scraped off to put a road there and make a soccer field. An ankle-breaking soccer field, I would add, because it's on really, anoxic soil is about 12 inches down. So when it's hard, it is, as an ultimate player told me, bone-crushing hard. So we're going to flow through the design as the stormwater would. What I'm going to do is take you from the top of that rightmost line down to the swervy thing at the bottom of the diagram. This sand-laden, because all stormwater that is extremely loaded with sand, at least in the geology of Piedmont, the sand-laden stormwater that's part of the pipes is brought to light. It's emerged from its underground pipes, and it pushes out of this kind of slit in the earth, and it becomes this copper runnel and flows into what's called the sand deposition theater. Which is a series of sand terraces that are edged with these gabion seat walls. These gabion seat walls are constructed first, and the sand forms the ground over time, emphasizing this idea of process. So the ecology of stormwater literally forms the space over time as sand is dumped into the space. There are rakes that hang on the performing arts wall that's adjacent to here for art patrons to participate in this activity, just as they participated in the activities of the concert that are going inside. And they can sort of compose their own plays in these sandboxes out here. and enclosed by the performing arts wall and this earthen hill that this thing is nestled up against. It's a kind of grotto, you know, leaving this moist quality of this land, this inhabited valley that I'm trying to get people to think about valuing these wet spaces of the campus. So here people, water, and sand are the actors with an emphasis on act. This copper runnel patinas and reflects and carries the water out of this sand depositional theater, and it transforms into a causeway that slips by and under an art gallery and disperses into what I call this marsh pool classroom. Here toxins settle and are taken up by wetland plants, and these earthen terraces slip from lawn to high marsh to low marsh to water, so that and I'm trying to explore these quantifiable aspects and bring that as part of the content of the design, so that as water evaporates, these new terraces are made available. They're revealed, and they have these new territory is revealed and made available for exploration. And we end up with a new use. A teaching space is made available to the university. Drivers then spill down this entry road onto this metal grate that's neither land nor water, that in-between condition. And wetland grasses emerge through the grate. And on drives and walking paths, the grasses are mown, forming a special type of walking surface that's, you know, not land, not water, but something else. And it's a transformation of a conventional lawn and simultaneously a reinterpretation of bridge and of plaza. It's neither solid nor fluid, and I want people to look at their feet, to look beneath them into these mysterious depths below. So it's a surface that changes every day with every footstep or car track and with every maintenance person who mows it differently. The water squeeze, oh, here we go. And it's also meant to be, finally, a really dramatic entry to the drama building, where now there's just this dumb little, you know, asphalt circle that you get out. But one to be one, we're going to the theater is finally about going to the theater. The water squeezes through a shadowed cavern of buildings, and it shifts from this plant-packed runnel to a slough. Is the sculpted landform that's supposed to reflect the art building, the studio art building that it foregrounds. And then Carr's Hill stormwater mixes with that of the larger watershed, and also mixes with what would be a sort of unearthing of Meadow Creek, which was a part of the university and a part of the town until the 1950s. And here water is impounded, is detained, I say, long enough to hold the campus's historical memory of recreational water that's played an incredibly important part in the social activity of the university until 1952. So once again, residents may ice skate in the winter and boat and cool their feet during those relentless Virginia summers. And the treatment of this pond is not a resurrection of a previous form of that historical pond. And I was also trying to distinguish it from, you know, a picturesque or pastoral water body, which we usually do. It's a basin whose shape has been designed to register the shifts in the water's seasonal water budgets. It's a figure that changes with the process and very distinctively changes with those processes, and it tries to accommodate that rather than it being just terrible looking. So by viewing the ecology, and I think the hydrology in particular, as an entity that's replete with history and not just biology, we are just so fixated on that. I think we have an expanded definition of what a term I think I'm getting ready to blast in an article, ecological design, because I'm not sure what it means anymore. It's a design that promotes the exploration of these reciprocating relationships between natural processes and constructed acts, and sees them as things that are in partnership and not distinctive and dichotomous from one another. And it's meant to be something that is about not about the forms, but the processes, about nutrient uptake, about sedimentation, seasonality, so that ecology is not just about these technical processes, but also about an experience that they can evoke by paying careful attention to them. And I'm also trying to get people to see that by understanding the processes, the historical processes as well as the biological ones, that we can see these as complex territory, as generator of programming. By paying attention to these, they can actually give us new programs that we don't have before and capable of filling many, many experiences. The other thing that I hope these mappings allow us to see is that water can be more than a site amenity, I hate that phrase, and something that's actually used for more than aesthetic properties. I hope that by mapping the water, these processes, that we can see ecology and hydrology in particular as an infrastructure, something that's essential. It's not an amenity, it's not an add-on, it's not an option, it's necessary. So in these Photoshop manipulated, this GIS map, like I said, it's spatially accurate. We start with a real thing that we got from the city. And to see how the stormwater system of the city is a constructed system of these different parts that really isn't about the system of elements, these series of elements, but more about a range of wetness conditions. To not see these water as discrete little entities that we can categorize. And so we manipulated this in Photoshop. We took the sets of watersheds and added on, of course, the streets and the parking lots because, you know, as I said, that's water too. It's almost as important as the rivers. And I hope that this helps us see that urbanized conditions are not black holes, you know, in ecological functions. We tend to just go, ooh, urban, nope, no ecology here. But in fact, there's very complex ecology here, and that we can't just shut our eyes to them, that this is just as much a part of designing as any other thing, and to see new possibilities. And so we expanded and, you know, blurred and things like this so that we could show that these things were really connected entities and not discrete ones separated from another. And another map of Charlottesville, it shows how not only the water, but the streets and parking, we're trying to get across that idea that they're extensions of the river system, that they cannot be separated. And I call it, in fact, I just coined this term, you know, this built natural landscape. That you really can't call it a natural landscape. You really can't call it built. It's a built natural landscape. And that these things are, I hope that by doing these kinds of mappings, we can start to see natural systems as more than just these, you know, those fuzzy, you know, heartstring, you know, pulling, you know, stuff that designers and developers are concerned about. And then there's something more than legislation, you know, that we have to comply with. That these are things that are necessary. They're quite given. It really isn't about some philosophical idea or anything else. That these are things that are necessary and that we must deal with them in a positive way and see them as integral to one another if we're going to get anywhere. Okay, so I hope that these demonstrations, that these maps and these explorations of mine demonstrate the value of spending effort in developing craft and technique and really giving thoughtful attention to how we represent sites to ourselves and then to others. Granted, these things take tremendous time and skill to develop the media and to think hard about developing these maps. Yet, I hope that I have at least tempted you to think about that this time and this thinking is not, it's incredibly fun. And it's wonderful exploration and it's really invigorating. But it also is really practically valuable because inevitably, anytime you map with this kind of care, it's an investment. It's an investment in your design and you give yourself so much to design with that it becomes easy. You know, once you've explored all this stuff and you're giving yourself this wonderful palette, the designing is so much easier. And in fact, you give yourself a site. Your site is not what's out there. It's what you make of it. You have to make your site. Each one of us has to make our site over and over again. So these carefully built and constructed mappings, I hope they fill your drawing boards with these conceptual ideas, these developmental tools, and data to make your design. And I'm hoping to convince Charlottesville to see its landscape like I do, as a way of creating a new Charlottesville, of making, as I said in the beginning, every time you map, you make a new world. And to see the world, at least in some way, as I've seen it, as a series of infrastructures that can be read individually, as city boundaries, as road, as tree cover, as inlets and manholes, and of river systems that you're seeing here. But all these individual discrete elements add up to something more. They're a series of infrastructures that can deliver those abstract services and structure movements and propel social efforts, and I think perhaps most importantly, connect us as citizens to the place we live, of showing Charlottesville that this is something that is actually very civic and has the potential to be something incredibly important in the design of the city and not just something peripheral. And I hope to show them, and I hope that you will maybe catch this bug, to see these windows, as I call these little holes in here, these inlet demarcations, as these windows of opportunity, these windows between the seen and the unseen worlds, to see the beauty of conventional infrastructure as well as this infrastructure we maybe hadn't thought of that way. For if our infrastructures, I think, address both of these aspects of delivering services, of being very practical, and giving us wonderful things to imagine about our sites, then we will have done a great good as designers. Not only for the biophysical systems, for the engineering, but for the systems that make, all the systems that make cities better, of making them better designed, more meaningful, and I think most importantly, of engaging people's imaginations, of connecting them to the places that they live, of helping them to dream, and not just wonder about the wonder of water, but all the wonder of life. Thank you very much for your attention.